Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with the Hebraic Roots Network. If you enjoy our great lineup of teachers and our excellent programming, please consider donating your financial gifts to the Hebraic Roots Network. You'll be glad you did. Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome to this series on the life of Hezekiah. This particular series is called Hezekiah in the Shadow of Messiah, and that's because the life of Hezekiah perfectly mirrors Yeshua the Messiah's life. You're going to see through this episode the numerous places in which the two lives cross over. Now, Hezekiah was mainly responsible for the restoration of the temple at his time. His father, Ahaz, had totally decimated the temple, basically had taken a lot of the vessels and things and threw them into the Kidron Valley, and the temple actually closed as a result of all that. And so Hezekiah came in and restored all that. He restored the faith. He brought back various institutions. There were great academies of learning all throughout the land. And really, his life is kind of ground zero in the life of the kings for that sort of restoration. Now, this period leading up to the time of Hezekiah under Ahaz, his father, King Ahaz, was a time of tremendous idolatry and paganism. So I actually see the two lives with Hezekiah and the Messiah and the times leading up to their lives are similar, but it's also very prophetic for our time as well. So I hope as we go through these programs that you're going to see the relationship between the two, Hezekiah and the Messiah, but you're also going to see how prophetic it is for the time in which we live in. Really, Hezekiah and his father Ahaz are kind of a tale of two kings and two kingdoms. And what we'll discover about the two, Ahaz, his name is very similar to Hezekiah. I hope you can hear that, which both have something to do with strength or strong. So Hezekiah, and we'll look at his name in a little more detail, is talking about the strength of God, where Ahaz, his name is really talking about the strong man. So you see these polar opposites here in their two lives. Now they do have a time in which they serve as co-regents, and we'll be talking about that as well, in which their time on the throne was overlapping. But really, this is the story of the defeat of the enemy, in this particular case, the Assyrians. It's a story of redemption, and it's a story of the resurrection of the dead. All the elements that we see in prophecy come to bear in the life of Hezekiah. And it's the story of this man, Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, who's the great deliverer of his people. And this is also the period in which Israel, the northern tribes, have been carried off by the Assyrians. So the focus here is on Judah, and I hope you see the parallels between that time and the time in which we live in. This is a time of the cleansing and purifying of the people, and really a story, I believe, that brings hope and healing, and that whole concept of restoration. Now also what's key in the story of Hezekiah are lots of archaeological elements. In particular, Hezekiah's tunnel. I'm sure some of you have been in the tunnel, walked through it. It's not a straight line, and you walk in very cold water. And this tunnel is very critical to our story, and really one of very significant finds in Israel. Also around the city of David, and we have the pool of Shiloah, or the pool of Siloam, which figures greatly in the story of Hezekiah. Of course, that would take us to John chapter 7, when Yeshua was going up to the temple at the time of Sukkot. And the pool of Shiloah plays an important role in the ceremony at Sukkot, the Simcha Beit HaShoeva, or the water drawing. So that there's a connection there. So we're going to be looking at some of the archaeology and some of the history, and hopefully through all that you can see the prophecy. I believe there's a lot of parallels, and again, we're going to be making a spiritual application for our lives today as we go through his life. It's quite key. And I believe that the archaeology helps us and enhances our understanding of the time of Hezekiah, and looking at its significance, and in particular its prophetic significance. So if we're going to study the life of Hezekiah, there are three scriptures in particular that we need to go to. And the first one is in 2 Kings 18 through 20. So I would encourage you to read those portions of scripture to get the backdrop for this particular series. Also, Isaiah 1 through 39 is really predominantly dealing with Hezekiah. And I think many of you would recognize already that those chapters, and especially in chapter 7, 8, and 9 of Isaiah, is pointing to the Messiah. So there we'll see some parallels there. And also 2 Chronicles chapters 29 through 32. So those are the predominant areas that we see the life of Hezekiah. There really is quite a bit on his life in the story, buried it there in the Kings through those various chapters. And the prophet that is prophesying during his life, of course, is Isaiah, Yeshayahu, who actually is a prophet for 52 years. And he prophesies through 4 kings. We have Uzziah, Jotam, Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, and of course Hezekiah himself. And then after Hezekiah, his son comes to the throne. That is Manasseh, who's a really bad guy. So Hezekiah is sandwiched in between his father, Ahaz, who is largely responsible for the decimation of the faith, and then Manasseh, who comes along and does all kinds of evil things and sets up an abomination in the temple. The other thing is that Hezekiah's life is very closely connected to the temple. There are things that he did we don't really see any of the other kings doing. So we want to be talking about that as well, because the temple is partly the key. His restoring the temple, and we can see that needs to happen in our time as well. So again, all these things connected to the Messiah. Now, as I was doing my research on this, I came across a quote from the rabbis which really got me started on it. And basically, this is their thinking. They said, the Holy One wished to appoint Hezekiah as the Messiah and Sennacherib as Gog and Magog. So this is very important. This is a key quote, and it sort of propelled me on this search here, because they believed that Hezekiah was the Messiah. So this isn't something I came up with. This is very much in the literature. And then they believed his adversary was King Sennacherib of Assyria, who represented Gog and Magog. And of course, you know, reading in Ezekiel 37, 38, 39, we have the whole story of Gog and Magog at the time of Sukkot, which has to do with the final redemption. So that pattern is in there. And this defeat of the enemy, in Hezekiah's case, Assyria, but ultimately the defeat of the enemy of God's people will take place at Sukkot. So in the life of Hezekiah, we have a pattern of redemption. In the same way, we have a pattern of redemption in the life of Yeshua. So hopefully you can see these parallels. Now let's just discuss Hezekiah's name first. So in Hebrew, it's Hezkiyahu, and it actually can mean a variety of things. The predominant meaning comes from the root word chazak, which means strong or strength. So here are just some of the definitions to his name. God is strength. We could say the strong one of Yah. Strength comes from God. Strengthened by God, or strength of God. All these variations of his name. But again, the key word there, chazak, means strong. And you may know when you conclude one of the books of the Torah, you'd say chazak, chazak, v'nit chazak. Be strong, be strong. And so really, even contained in that, we see the initial part of Hezekiah's name. Now, one of the expressions that we have from the prayers, the Amidah prayers, the 18 benedictions, one of the prayers is called the Goel Hazak, which means the strong Redeemer. And so I believe that Hezekiah, even in his name, reflects the concept of the strong Redeemer, and that the strong Redeemer would come at the Geula, at the time of the redemption. And in the prayer it talks about, oh, you are God, the strong Redeemer. So I hope as we go through this you'll see those connections. Now, the Talmudists, their opinion of Hezekiah, their quote is that he who made a strong alliance between God and Israel. So this is very key, because Hezekiah was pictured as being a mediator then between God and Israel, in the same way that Yeshua is a picture of him as a mediator between man and God. and between heaven and earth. So this concept of a mediator who brings a strong alliance between two parties is seen in the name of Hezekiah, and also we can see that perfectly fulfilled in the life of Yeshua. Now, one of the most significant things about the life of Hezekiah is that he expanded the Temple Mount. And so when he came, people have an idea that, we had the first temple that was, the designs were given by David, and his son Solomon actually built the temple, and so here's this temple built, and then that's the end of it. Eventually, of course, it was destroyed by the Babylonians. But you'll find that there's changes that the temple and the mount and the structure goes through over the kings of Judah. And really, when we get after the damage that King Ahaz, his father, had done, King Hezekiah comes back in to restore. So he expanded the Temple Mount to these measurements that some of you may be familiar with. We call it the 500 cubits by 500 cubits. So many additions to the Temple Mount came as a result of what Hezekiah did, and honestly right through to the time of the Hasmoneans, and then eventually King Herod built the second temple, which was obviously quite a bit larger. But the temple, of course, being the center of life, the life of the community of Israel, and Hezekiah was greatly responsible for that expansion, and this was very significant. One of the reasons that he expanded the Temple Mount in this way was to accommodate the great number of worshipers. So if we look at the picture at the time, this is shortly after Israel has gone into captivity with the Assyrians. Of course, Israel's been worshiping up north. Shechem is their headquarters, Tel Dan, and it's been a religion that has replaced the structure of the temple, and they are no longer there. And the whole institution and the system really has fallen into disrepair under King Ahaz, and so there's this revival, if you will, when Hezekiah comes to the throne, and we'll see that exactly what he does right out of the gate. And so now people are coming back up to Jerusalem, and of course they've got to clean things up, but they need to make more room for the worshipers that come up. So he is responsible then for enlarging the 500 cubits by 500 cubits. Again, his father Ahaz had totally defiled the temple and defiled the services, really reducing it to a garbage heap for all intents and purposes. And then Hezekiah comes in and cleanses and rebuilds that structure, and part of that is not only a physical rebuilding of the temple area, but it's also a spiritual rebuilding. So that is the nature of the life of Hezekiah. So the temple's expanded, it's cleaned out, and then there's this spiritual rebuilding of the faith and a restoration in that regard. So we see at the same time Yeshua in his first coming, although the temple is built and functioning, but there's a restoration that takes place, if you will, in the faith. And then it's pointing us ahead in the future at that prophetic time when both will be, the temple will be restored as it was supposed to be, and the faith itself will be restored as well. So in a sense, it's the temple becomes a physical reality of a sort of a spiritual manifestation, and we see that through the life of Hezekiah. Now, another archaeological place in Jerusalem that was of great importance at the time of Hezekiah is the Gihon Spring. And there's excavations going on there. Originally, there were great towers, and you can see the leftovers of those towers if you go down to that particular site. The towers, this is the main water supply for Jerusalem. So it was incumbent upon these kings to do everything they could to protect that water supply. Otherwise, the people in Jerusalem would have no drinking water, no water to use. And so these towers were built to protect against the enemy. Interestingly enough, the Gihon was referred to as the fountain of living water. We're going to talk about that in a later program, but the idea of the water gently flowing down from the Gihon into the Shiloah, or the Siloam, into the pool of Siloam. And so Hezekiah, we find, was involved in a lot of construction in his day. He is responsible for an awful lot. And so those of you who've been in the Old City will see the remains of one of Hezekiah's walls of the outer area of Jerusalem, which I find to be quite fascinating, to be able to actually see that wall in the Old City. And Hezekiah was one that, he gets a bad rap sometimes because he was kind of willing to give up his people so he could have an additional 15 years. But I hope as you go through this, you'll see that it's not entirely the case. But he really, of all of the kings of Judah, committed himself in prayer to the life of the people of that time and to their spiritual needs, to the spiritual needs of the nation. So again, it's a story of history, it's a story of prophecy. We have the archaeology today, it's a story of redemption, and it's an important story connected to the Messiah. And really the spiritual revival or resurrection, if you want to call it, of a nation, and a return and a dedication back to God. And the context of all of that is, again, the temple. And it is for this reason that the sages all connected Hezekiah to the Messiah, because the Messiah would do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to spend a little time here going through the history of Hezekiah and just sort of what's going on at the time. It's very important when you're studying to look at the cultural context. So you want to look at the history and the culture. You want to look at the geography and the archaeology to help you understand the passages of Scripture. You understand that nothing is static in the history of Israel. So if you were to study the time of the patriarchs, you would be looking at different backdrop of a wilderness nomadic type life, and you would investigate how enemies came against people. They would use different types of warfare, whatever weapons were at their disposal. And coming to the kings, you have to look at it in an entirely different light. So now they are settled, they're living in cities, they're living in walled cities. Life is, for all intents and purposes, evolving. And this is true of any culture. So it's important to get the time period in which you're looking and make sure you understand what's going on. So first, he is a king of Judah. That's important. And he comes to the throne at the age of 25. And we will later see how 25 is kind of significant. He is the son of Ahaz, as I've mentioned, and his mother, her name is Aviah. He is the sole ruler over Jerusalem or over Judah for 29 years. And he actually is a co-regent then with his father, King Ahaz. Now, we don't know the exact dates on all this, but there is an overlap of some kind between Ahaz and Hezekiah. And that's important. These co-regencies will throw us off in the dating, and we'll see that in just a minute. And so you could actually say at the time of these co-regencies that one king or the other was actually king, and it does cause some confusion because they're actually ruling together. And the final very important piece of information in the life of Hezekiah is a fixed date in history, 701 BCE, which is when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacks Judah. And it's great because we have a fixed date so we can work backwards and forwards with some degree of accuracy. I just kind of throw this out there, but to me it's interesting, the 701 BCE, because it could be a parallel then of something prophetic, looking at 7,000, these 7,000 years. So in the year 7001, perhaps this repeat attack by Assyria, who is as a picture of Gog and Magog, happens. So that's interesting. Of course, we know that Hezekiah was given an additional 15 years. He became very ill, nearly died, and that 15-year period in there is very significant. So those are just some of the facts about his life, and they will become important as we go through the series. Now, we have very little information on this, but it tells us in Scripture in 2 Kings 21:1 that Hephzibah was his wife. And really very little mention is made of her, but we know Hephzibah was Manasseh's mother. She is Hezekiah's wife, and her name means "in whom is my delight." And it's interesting because we have virtually nothing said about Hephzibah. And to me, possibly a picture, if Hezekiah is a pattern after Yeshua, perhaps the bride of Hezekiah, Hephzibah, is a picture of Messiah's bride, the bride of Messiah. And that, as that bride, she is kind of a hidden treasure, which actually the name could be translated that as well, "in whom is my delight," or hiding a treasure. So hopefully we'll see that there's a parallel there as well. Now, one of the sources I used for a lot of this information comes from a man named Edwin Teale. He wrote a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. And I think it's a very important book. Now, it is kind of academic. And some of it, your eyes can roll back with the details and the numbers in it, hence called the Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. But it is, I think, an important source in trying to sort out who's ruling when, and we have differences between Israel and Judah, and I think if we're going to try to uncover what's going on with the kings, I think that's a good place to look. So through his book, Edwin Teale's book, he discusses a lot of the controversies in the dating. He looks at the synchronisms between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, because that's important. And I would have to say some of it's probably somewhat controversial. I don't know that we can really nail it down. But we'll find that King Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, is actually the king of Judah at the time Samaria falls. And that's significant, of course, because when Samaria falls, that's when the Assyrians take Israel, the northern tribes, off and scatter them through the four corners of the Assyrian Empire. The last king of Israel, not Judah, but the last king of Israel at that time when Samaria falls is King Hoshea. And Teale has been able to sort of put these chronologies together from his historical events. And often this chronology will help explain the accession as they come to power, as they reign, the differences between Israel and Judah. Needless to say, it's a rather difficult topic, but I think it's important to try to nail it down as best we can. There are significant dating issues and problems between the two reigns, between Judah and Israel. And we actually have two different methods of identifying when a king ascends to the throne. And one of these two methods, one is assigned to Israel and the other one is assigned to Judah. So that makes things confusing as well. So let's look first at the non-accession year method. And this is important. So the non-accession year, this year, so the king died, and the problem is that in the year that he died, a reign would have been counted twice. So the portion of the year that he died was counted to him, and then the remainder of the year when the new king came was also counted. So you have a double counting here. You've got 2 years given in one. So needless to say, that's going to cause all kinds of headaches. Normally, the non-accession year method is applied to Israel. And then in contrast, well, let me just mention with Israel, Israel's regnal year began in Nisan. And so that's the first month. So Nisan 1, the first month, is when a king normally would come to power in terms of Israel. And this, again, is the non-accession year. And again, portions of the year get counted to two of them. And let me just mention, Nisan 1 is a pretty critical day in the Bible. Those of you familiar with the Exodus, the book of Exodus, Shemot, when you get to looking at the raising up of the tabernacle, you'll find that it was raised up and dedicated on Nisan 1. So there's something there that communicates the king ruling over the whole of Israel. So we can look at Exodus 40, verse 1. It says, God spoke to Moshe, saying, on the day of the first new moon, on the first of the month, you shall erect the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. So let me read that again. God spoke to Moshe, saying, on the first day of the first new moon, on the first of the month, you shall erect the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. And this is when the tabernacle was dedicated, so on the first of Nisan. And again, this is the day in which the kings of Israel would be raised up and be crowned king. So this particular day is signifying something important about God dwelling permanently amongst his people. And as I mentioned, I believe there's something critical being pointed here in terms of God being in the presence of his people on that day in which the king is ruling over all of Israel. Now we contrast that with the kings of Judah, and their time is Tishrei. And we'll see that in just a second here. Now Judah is going with the accession year method. So with the accession year method, you didn't count portions of the year for a king's reign. So the accession year method would obviously be normal. There would just be 1 year there. So the portion of the year of the king would only be counted once. And this is how it was structured for Judah. So we don't have a double counting then with the accession year method. So you can see that there are two different methods, based on the two. So as we look at Judah, the regnal year for Judah starts in Tishrei. Now Tishrei is the 7th month of the year, and again the accession year method is what is applied to Judah. So Judah started their reign in the 7th month, and Israel started their reign in the 1st month, and typically on what we call a Rosh Chodesh. Now interestingly enough, for the kings of Judah, if they started on the first day of the 7th month, you would know that that's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, the day of the awakening blast, and the beginning then of the season, the fall festivals. Now, I want to just mention again Hoshea, the king of Israel, because he is the last king of Israel. And what we find that there really doesn't seem to be a relationship a literal relationship between Hoshea and Hezekiah. So Hoshea is the king of Israel. He's the last king. And he, we think, begins to rule Israel sometime around 732 BCE. At that same time, in 732 BCE, Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, is on the throne. And we don't find any contact then between Hezekiah and Hoshea. So that's significant, and because we're going to find that Hezekiah is ruling much later. So there is an account, and you can read in 2 Kings 18, that talks about Hoshea reigning and in conjunction with Hezekiah. So this seems like a conundrum here. There's some confusion. And this could be one of those examples of the co-regency. And so there was a connection then between Ahaz and Hoshea, but since there was a co-regency, it's likely that's you could call King Hezekiah's time, but you could be referring to King Ahaz. I know that sounds kind of confusing, and that's really not the way things function today, but that was the way it was, and so that might answer that particular problem. Hezekiah was not on the throne of Judah when Samaria fell. Ahaz was, and that's important. And so we have a map here, just kind of give you a picture of sort of the Sumerian region, which is where, of course, the northern tribes were centered here and hauled off into captivity by the Assyrians. And this is the fall of Samaria normally is identified to be at 721, 722 BCE. However, Teal, in his book, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, puts it at 723. And for the purposes of this teaching, I'm just going to go with Teal's date. We don't really know for sure, and there's some debate over that. But Teal believes it was 723 BCE. And again, the scriptures are silent on any contacts between the two. And this is actually quite unusual because typically through the reigns of the kings, king of Judah and the king of Israel, you have a lot of dialogue and communication going on. And all through the records, we see that there's constant references between the two rulers. And we don't really find any here with King Hezekiah. So the key in all of this is then we're looking at relationships then between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And we're looking at the relationship between Ahaz and Hezekiah. And so we're looking for things about those time frames that are going to point us ahead to the time of Yeshua the Messiah. And so hopefully as we go through this, it'll all start making sense. There's a lot of history in this, and when you're reading the scriptures, sometimes you can just go right past it without really paying much attention. And really, when you start reading it was the king of Judah, it was the king of Israel, and it's sort of mind-numbing, and you just kind of miss a lot of what's going on there. So I would just encourage you to follow along with this. Go ahead and read the backdrop of Hezekiah if you're joining in on this study, and hopefully it'll make more sense. So we'll see you next time. Shalom.
Want more Dinah Dye? Get her 7-part teaching, Service of the Heart, now on DVD at HebraicRootsNetwork.com.